Peter Gruber from the Oratory in Pittsburgh, the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. He's had a long trip to make it here to be with us today, and some of you may have heard him preaching on this. He was a student at Pitt State, right?
University of Pittsburgh.
University of Pittsburgh, and where he came into contact with the Oratory, we do campus ministries and that sort of thing, and since then decided to join the Oratory.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Anything else that we should know about you?
I can talk more about myself, I guess, if you want me to, but I have a lot of stuff to get through. We're not even going to use all the quotes I put on this. This is too many words. We've already passed that.
Actually,
Are we recording right now? Oh man.
You're live, actually.
Okay. Let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Blessed Virgin Mary, we look to you as our model and as our mother. Watch over us. May your heart speak to our hearts. We might become like you. We might imitate your example. We might follow you in following the will of God the Father and following after your Son, standing by him at the cross. May we be transformed by our contact with you and the Sacred Heart of your Son. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So thank you for having me. My talk is called Heart Speaks to Heart, Personal Influence in the Life and Work of St. John Henry Newman. First, a word about me and why I am giving this talk. In addition to being just responding to an invitation from Colton to come here, I thought it would make sense as a priest of the Oratory to talk about something that is very central to how we carry out ministry and how we live our lives as Oratorian priests. You might have recognized that the way I dress, that I'm not normal. and that's because I'm not a normal diocesan priest. I'm not a normal religious priest like a Dominican, Franciscan, or something like that. The Oratory is kind of like a weird amphibian combination of different kinds of living out consecrated life in the church, or not even consecrated life, just being a priest in the church. We aren't religious. We don't take vows. We're just like all the other diocesan priests that technically don't take vows either. They make promises. And they're really strong promises. We definitely don't want to break the promises, but no vows. So we're more like diocesan priests there. But we live in community for life, in the same place, under a rule. So we're actually more like Benedictines, or like a combination of the two. I like to think the best of both worlds. Of course, objectively, Benedictines, Dominicans, Franciscans, they're all higher forms of life because they vow poverty, chastity, and obedience, or they have different vows as Benedictines, and that's okay too. But for me, it's a very comfortable way to live and very natural for me. I grew up in a large family. I was the 8th of 14. So to be part of a kind of a family kind of environment where I'm not going to be moved. There's no threat that can be carried out. Oh, if you don't get along, you'll just be moved somewhere else. I'm living with the people I'm with for my life. And they're living with me for their lives. So it's very natural and congenial to my own experience. And I wanted to talk today about St. John Henry Newman because he is an Oratorian. Now, the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, St. John Henry Newman, when he became a Catholic, he became a priest of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. And so his spirituality dovetailed really, really well with the spirituality of St. Philip and the Oratory. And I'll talk much about that. Probably too much of my talk will be about the Oratory and the life and the work of St. John Henry Newman. But it's worthwhile maybe going a little bit over just a brief overview of St. John Henry Newman's life to give you an idea of what we're talking about. He was born in 1801. He died in 1890. In those 89 years, he had quite a tumultuous life. Extremely gifted, incredibly intelligent. He went to Oxford, and then after Oxford, he ended up getting ordained as an Anglican priest. and he was an Anglican, a true Anglican, a defender of Anglicanism against Protestantism on one side and Roman Catholicism on the other side. He thought they were the true Catholic Church, the true successors of the apostles of the Church Fathers. He saw the Anglican Church as a via media, as a middle road between the two extremes of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. And he was involved in a huge movement that had major ramifications across the world called the Oxford Movement, which led towards a kind of Catholicizing, going back to the deep church roots, the Church Fathers' roots of Christianity for the Anglicans, and getting to a deeper, more real liturgy, more vibrant living out of their faith. And after he did that, he actually converted to Catholicism at age 44-ish in 1845, and that shook the world of Anglicanism, shook the world of Christianity. And then he went off to become a priest. He studied in Rome for a few years, became a priest of the Oratory, and then lived out the rest of his life in Birmingham, with a brief interlude in Ireland, where we get the lectures on what's now called the idea of the university. And this is how he gets associated very strongly with the idea of education, especially Catholic higher education, from his writings about the role of the university in forming the human person. And he has a lot of contributions to the realms of philosophy, of church history, of the issues of his day. And we'll get into some of those. I want to go back to when he was still an Anglican. He was invited to speak. He had 15 sermons he preached for Oxford itself. And they're really more like lectures given to an academic audience. And he devoted many of those specifically to faith and reason. The one that we're going to talk about is called Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth. So the way this, pretty much the whole talk is going to go, is that I will give an overview of this sermon and just kind of go over the salient points, skipping over the things I just don't feel like explaining. And then moving from that to looking at how the central principle of the sermon is lived out consistently by Newman in different facets of his life and his work. Okay, so let's enter a little bit into this sermon. I can't give the entire thing. I determined that if I were to just read the sermon, it would take 50 minutes and I'd be done. And so we can't do that. So we're going to have to hit the main points. So Newman is reflecting on, to his Oxford University audience, how is it that Christianity first spread? There were a lot of things stacked up against Christianity. One big thing, the Roman Empire. Another thing, the attitudes of those that retain their Jewish religion. The fact that the great expounder of Christianity died and was no longer with them. Well, there are a lot of reasons why Christianity should not have spread, but it did. And so Newman asked, and this is the second half of that first quote that I handed out to you, what is that hidden attribute of the truth? And how does it act, prevailing as it does single-handed over the many and multiform errors by which it is simultaneously and incessantly attacked? Taking for granted here that Christianity is in possession of the truth, capital T. How did truth get out? How did it propagate? So Newman kind of goes into this sort of, almost like a thought experiment. What if there was a perfectly virtuous man who was entirely moral, who stood out? How would it work? How would the truth work with a moral living out of it? So he's this perfectly morally upright man. And he knows that if someone was really just, they're really virtuous, he would strain the consciences of others around him. They would see his behavior and how he acts and how he doesn't act. And they would think, why is it that I do this opposite thing against my conscience? They feel pricked. They wonder what is going on. Newman is sort of even right here appealing to this idea that we all have an objective idea of what's right and wrong through the conscience, something he later talks about more clearly in something like the Grammar of Assent. But here in his as he's 31 years old, he says that the consciences of men will be strained by him. And then people seeing him, they would maybe be repulsed, they fall backwards. Others would follow him, but they wouldn't keep on following him. And some would actually get better and better at imitating his example. And those that are kind of getting better at following him and living like he lived, they would get stronger and stronger. They'd be underneath his sway. When someone lives differently, they want to be like that person. And so they would develop some moral principles and habits, and it'd be uniform. They would actually, because they're all following the same exemplar of morality, they would all be following it together the same, and it would reinforce itself. Now, it would be a very slow process. Meanwhile, the exemplar of these virtues, who's living a perfectly moral, upright life, he would not be able to explain why it is he does the things he does. If if it's just something that you're so imbued with, you can't possibly explain it. I recall how Chesterton says, you ask someone who believes in God why he believes in God, and he'll be like, because that chair over there, and that camera. You don't say camera, we didn't have cameras back then for Chesterton's age, but he would just point to things and be like, it would just be too much. It goes beyond our capacity of human language to even communicate too, because when you're just living it, it's a different kind of knowledge to live out virtue than to explain it. You could read St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, the Prima Secundae and the Secunda Secundae, and you could understand virtue. It does not mean you practice it. Practical knowledge of it is far different. It is connatural to you. And it kind of goes beyond the ability of language to explain it. So this perfect, morally upright person is himself limited because he can't even explain it. So now we can kind of think, who would be the perfectly morally upright person? And obviously, the one person that was always lived rightly, perfectly ordered, is Christ. And if you look at how he actually affected those around him, Newman has this to say. This is the second quote. Eventually, I'll lose track of what number of quotes these are, so you have to follow along. And I give you the quotes on a page because it's just a lot of words, and it's hard to just hear someone else reading someone else's words. So Newman says, some hearers of it had their consciences stirred for a while, and many were affected by the awful simplicity of the great teacher. But the proud and sensual were irritated into opposition. The philosophic considered his doctrines strange and chimerical. The multitude followed for a time in senseless wonder, and then suddenly abandoned an apparently fallen cause. Yet, blessed be God, the power of truth actually did, by some means or other, overcome these vast obstacles to its propagation. Somehow, truth was going to win out. Before Newman gets into how it worked, he wanted to point out the obstacles. What was really in the way? How is it that error seems to hold more of a sway over people? We can ask this in our own day. How is it that so many people believe so many different kinds of lies? They are under the sway of different influences. What is going on with that? Why is it always seems that Christianity's on the losing side? Why is that Catholicism always has to kind of fight back? Is it as J.R.R. Tolkien says that we have to abide the long defeat, and the history of Catholicism is a history of abiding the long defeat? In a way, yes. Error seems to have a lot of advantages over truth, and Newman gets into them. First, error has a tendency to dissect truth into pieces, and then it throws questions at it all over the place, and there's just like scatter shots, and it's impossible to answer every single charge. And it's really hard. It strains our intellects to be able to explain why this person's wrong about every little thing. And while we are trying to get our arguments together, error will claim victory. Second reason why error has a sway is that it has no reverence in choosing for its objects what it's going to critique or investigate. We as Catholics hold up the Eucharist, for example, and we want to treat it with the utmost reverence. What if someone attacks the Eucharist? Well, we don't want to, we have a hard time resisting because we don't want to fall into the same kind of irreverence. And things like the belief of God. We want to respect the name of God, his attributes. We don't have the same lack of like the unscrupulous mind approaching these things, and so we're at a disadvantage. The third reason is that error has an upper hand in shallow argumentation. it gives itself over to rash exaggerations, and a lot of times sort of attacks that are not even based on logical deductions. And that kind of overwhelms us as well. Another interesting point is that someone who practices error, who believes things that are false, could even actually be virtuous in some way. They might follow this kind of way of thinking. They might say that abortion is okay, but look how they love the environment, and people love how they love the environment. This is a contemporary example, but how interesting how they have some kind of virtue. And everyone loves when anytime there's a moral discussion, people love to bring up comparisons to Nazi Germany, for example. But you can look at some of the Nazi officials and like, oh, they love their families. Well, good, I want them to love their families, but that's really, really, really awful what they did. Sometimes there can be a virtue, a seeming apparent virtue in some area that allows them to be extolled and held up as exemplars, even though in other areas they are outright wrong. Another reason why error wins is that they're divorced from personal experience. Their reasons are impersonal. Try attacking science. You can't. It's impersonal. You can't attack evolutionary thought and its excesses because there's no person behind it. There's no face. There's no one to discredit. It's anonymous. So they are saved from the personal attacks because of anonymity. And if you dare attack them in their person, well, that's just wrong. You can't attack their person because it's the ideas that matter. And they have a lot of refuge in what Newman will call the notional. And then, and that's the sixth reason as well, the anonymity. So with all of these things working against truth, how is it that truth can still propagate? That can go from person to person, heart to heart. Newman says, truth has been upheld in the world not as a system, not by books, not by argument, nor by temporal power, but by the personal influence of such men as have already been described, who are at once the teachers and the patterns of it. Personal influence. That is the key. One to one, heart to heart, truth spreads. It is like at the Easter Vigil, when the light is lit, the candle is lit, and everyone's individual candles are lit, and it stretches outward, person to person, candle to candle, and soon the whole church is inflamed with light. It is through personal contact, personal relationships, friendships, knowledge of one's own heart, knowledge of the other person. Truth spreads. It has always been this way. From the beginning of the church, it was Christ to his 12 apostles, spreading the truth from Christ between him and the Father, him giving forth, himself to these 12 men, investing in them. Some would absolutely reject him. Some would deny him. But even though they are frail instruments, human beings subject to all the other problems of error, truth prevailed. This is how truth goes slowly through personal contact, personal influence. Because it has a sway over us. Actual virtue, not just some sort of facile virtue, is incredibly appealing. We recognize it, we see it. We're caught in its sway. We're inflamed by it, and we follow after. Virtue is learned by imitation. And if someone's practicing virtue perfectly, we want to follow after them. True holiness is also scarce. It's rare we find an example, but once we do, it's in high demand. We want examples. We need saints. There was a contemporary Catholic writer who said that the crisis that we now face as Catholics is a crisis of saints. And then holiness by itself is powerful. It unbalances the enemy. One little deed could be enough to plant a seed, to cause an effect that down the road has an immense impact. Newman writes, one little deed done against natural inclination for God's sake, though of itself of a conceiting or passive character, to brook an insult, to face a danger, or to resign an advantage, has in it a power outbalancing all the dust and chaff or mere profession. And holiness also grounds us in a foundation we cannot be assailed by our enemies. This is to be built on solid rock, not to be built on the sand. And then eventually, gradually, over time, virtue tames the world around us. It makes the world around us into kind of more of our home. It makes it part of us. It makes it amenable to us. But it's a slow process. And I think tame is a good word. If you've ever had to tame a dog, to train a dog, it's a very slow process, but it works. It never has not worked. And individuals, yes, everyone has freedom, but the truth has us swayed because we are made for a truth. And then that last point that Newman makes, why this is so effective, he says that those that are in affliction are not able to rely on the support of the world. When error is propagating and someone is hurting, they cannot find solace in the world. They cannot find solace in error. It does not support them. Where do they turn? But to the truly virtuous, to the truly holy. Suffering, then, instead of being something that weighs us down and always causes us to turn away from God, has an opposite effect of bringing us closer to Him. This is why the church seems to excel as we look backwards throughout history in times of pronounced martyrdom. When there is adversity, when there is increased suffering, we find refuge in the only place where we can. Not in the comforts of the world, but the one who's poured himself out for us on the cross. Let's stop there for the consideration of this homily. I think there's more that can be said, but I want to move on to how it is lived out by Newman. This central concept of personal influence, Newman lived consistently throughout his life. Although he underwent a great change in 1845, entering into the Catholic Church, he had lived this out from his earliest years. While he was at Oxford, he was a tutor. Oxford is a tutor system. It's not a professor with classes and TAs, but rather it's an individual tutor going to students. It's a one-on-one encounter. But Newman will always stress a heart-to-heart encounter. At the same time, he was a tutor, teaching people individual subjects. He was also a pastor. He was an Anglican priest. And he always saw his role as a tutor within Oxford to be pastoral. It actually is one of those things that got him in conflict with the provost of Oxford at that time. Eventually got to the point where, for a number of other reasons as well, that he was no longer being assigned any students to tutor. And so by 1832, by the time he preached this sermon on personal influence, his actual personal influence in being a tutor had waned. But there's a long quote here that I not include on your page from one of the people that he tutored. This is from James Anthony Froude. And he reminisced about how Newman was as a tutor. With us undergraduates, Newman spoke about subjects of the day, of literature, of public persons and incidents, of everything which was generally interesting. He seemed always to be better informed on common topics of conversation than anyone else who was present. He was never condescending with us, never didactic or authoritative. But what he said carried conviction along with it. When we were wrong, he knew why we were wrong, and excused our mistakes to ourselves, which he set us right. Perhaps his supreme merit as a talker was that he never tried to be witty or to say striking things. Ironical he could be, but not ill-natured. Not a malicious anecdote was ever heard from him. Prosy he could not be. He was lightness itself, the lightness of elastic strength. And it was interesting because he never talked for talking's sake, but because he had something to say. This person living out these virtues, even as an Anglican, powerful impact within this university setting. Newman, while he was an Anglican, he was in charge of St. Mary's, which was the parish church of Oxford. And from his preaching there, we have a collection of 8 volumes of sermons called the Parochial and Plain Sermons. And these had a massive impact, not only to those that heard his words, but beyond that, when they were published, people would eat them up. They were filled with a living faith. Now, he did not deliver them in any kind of exciting way. Newman was not a kind of an orator in that respect, but his words themselves had a power, and they carried himself along with them. In his sermons, he was intimately acquainted with his own heart, and he was able to read the hearts of his fellow men, that he seemed to know their inmost secrets. One of his parishioners said, "Persons look into Mr. Newman's sermons and see their own thoughts in them." There's kind of a personal influence, even from a pulpit. Not able to talk one-on-one, but each experiencing him. It was a one-on-one experience. I recall how St. John Paul II, although he was the most seen person in all of history, most likely, when people would catch his eye in a crowd, they felt like they were the only person that mattered. He was able to exercise a personal influence, even as he was ahead of a 1 billion person church. And that's the same kind of influence Newman had, albeit on a much smaller scale. Newman was even lamented that he did not have the same influence that he had. He wasn't able to affect hearts on the same level while he was at St. Mary's, because he wasn't able to visit the sick. He wasn't able to go to the houses and invite people to come back to divine worship. He couldn't do any of those things. So he lamented that, but it was very clear that his personal influence was expressed through that. In 1833, Newman came back from a sea voyage, and he had this sense that God was expecting something of him. There was some work he needed to accomplish. And he got back, and through the personal influences of his own friends, the people in Oxford, people like John Keble or Wilberforce, or these other names, if you ever, great book if you want to read it, great suggestion, fascinating read, not boring at all. Marvin O'Connell's The Oxford Conspirators. It's fantastic. It makes every person come alive, and it makes the story fit together so well. And to spoil the ending, Newman becomes Catholic, and it's great. So if you need a great book, Oxford Conspirators, wonderful book. But you can see the connections between persons, how Newman works within making these tracts, which were anonymous. They weren't the same kind of tools of personal influence, but the ideas behind them were living. The ideas of resistance to empty rituals and paper religion, a mere notional assent, or a kind of a superficial approach to looking like you live out your faith. The rediscovery of the church fathers, and then the kind of Catholicizing of the Anglican religion. These were lived among these persons, even as they remained anonymous. It was called the Oxford movement because it came from a group from Oxford. It was also called the Tractarians because it was through tracts that were just these long things printed and published and sent out that he was able to exercise a kind of influence. And Newman writes later in one of his meditations as a Catholic, and I think this is just a good description of what was happening here in the Oxford movement. Newman writes, "God has created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me, which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. I have a part in this great work. I am a link and a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. I shall do good. I shall do his work." Newman understood it intimately, how important it was to be that bond of connection between persons. When he preached his last sermon as an Anglican, knowing that he was no longer able to exercise that same influence, when his position in the Anglican Church had dwindled because of controversy, and his name became disreputable because of the insults turned against him for what they accused him of was a kind of introduction of Roman Catholic ideas into his thoughts, which was not his intention, but he was on his way out of the Oxford movement, his way out of the Anglican Church. He writes to his brother, he says to his brothers in a sermon, which he calls the parting of friends. And I think it's just beautifully expressive of his own knowledge, of his own influence. "And know, my brethren, O kind and affectionate hearts, O loving friends, should you know any one whose lot it has been, by writing or a word of mouth, in some degree to help you thus to act, he has ever told you what you knew about yourselves, or what you did not know, has read to you your wants or feelings, and comforted you by the very reading, has made you feel there was a higher life than this daily one, and a brighter world than that you see, or encouraged you, or sobered you, or opened a way to the inquiring, or soothed the perplexed. If what he has said or done has ever made you take interest in him, and feel well inclined towards him, remember such a one in time to come, though you hear him not, and pray for him, that in all things he may know God's will, and at all times he may be ready to fulfill it. That ends Newman's final words as an Anglican, pretty much. He began this work called the Essay on Development of Doctrine. And it was his own kind of study into the ideas that were there in the early church, and the church fathers, and did they retain their initial kernel of truth? Did they evolve to become something different? Was there corruption? And he looked at this in particular to, does the Roman Catholic Church possess the truth, even though there are clear changes from the early church? He did this study to find that there are ways in which doctrine does develop and grow like a tree from a seed. How everything that was there and necessary for its growth was there initially with the apostles, but was able to grow into something greater. And he published this. He actually just stopped writing pretty much, and he sent a letter to now Blessed Dominic Barbary and said, and he asked to be received in the Catholic Church. That he was so convinced interiorly of the truth of the Catholic Church. And that began a new phase in his life. But from this, from even a study of the development of doctrine, you see how truth propagates in persons. And that the church is in itself a personal entity. It is a body composed of persons. And that thoughts, truths propagate and expand in response to controversy, in response to new ways of engaging it. It changes in order to stay the same. And that's a fascinating insight that he sees that this organ of truth that is the Catholic Church and has infallibility built into it and must have infallibility built into it to protect truth. It actually fits. Everything about the Catholic system fits. And then he ended up converting as a result. And he says, it's a quotation from the development of doctrine. From the nature of the human mind, time is necessary for the full comprehension and perfection of great ideas, and the highest and most wonderful truths, though communicated to the world once for all by inspired teachers, cannot be comprehended all at once by the recipients, but as being received and transmitted by minds, not inspired, and through media which were human, have required only the longer time and deeper thought for their full elucidation. This may be called the theory of development of doctrine. So in a way, this can be argued probably better and more deeply. Even his conversion into the Catholic Church and his discovery of these principles and how doctrine works over time is a kind of an effect of truth spreading through personal influence. When he became Catholic, he had in mind to become ordained in the Catholic Church, and he had a choice to make. Was he going to become a Jesuit? Was he going to be a Dominican? Was he going to maybe some other kind of order? How was he going to be a Catholic priest? And he did a study of different things. He looked into it very closely. And he ended up settling on the oratory of St. Philip Neri. He said it was very Italian, but with modifications that don't ruin its character, it can be brought into England. And he was able to start the oratory in Birmingham. While he was away, he delivered these these letters, these addresses. He was in Ireland trying to set up a university there, and he delivered these addresses to his brothers at the Birmingham Oratory. And these became collected in this book, Newman the Oratorian, but they're called the Oratory Lectures. And he explained what it is that makes an oratory, what makes it different from the common kind of diocesan priests, or different from other religious orders. And of course, at the center was St. Philip Neri. St. Philip Neri was a saint that lived in the 1500s, born in 1515, died in 1595. And Newman has a wonderful sermon. He wrote and rewrote it several times, but it's called The Mission of St. Philip Neri. And it's probably the best introduction to the life of St. Philip and why his method works. In this sermon, Newman contrasts St. Philip Neri with another reformer that lived only a few decades before St. Philip. St. Philip was originally from Florence, and Florence had seen the height of the Renaissance well before it was experienced in Rome. And in Florence, there was a lot of the scholars, a lot of artists from Constantinople after it was invaded by the Turks. They came over to Florence and they settled, and there was this great revival of classical learning. There's a revival of interest in classical art. And with that too came a lot of excesses. Also, at the same time, the introduction of the printing press. So new ways to deliver large quantities of written material. And with that came a lot of excesses, a lot of moral problems, a lot of artwork that was less than savory and in fact probably, you could say, offensive to anyone's moral imagination. And so it seemed like there were a lot of problems. There's a lot of also corruption within the different families like the Medici family or other people in Florence at that time. So in the late 1400s, one of the priests of the Dominican convent of St. Mark's in Florence, his name was Girolamo Savonarola, he stood up and he denounced the excesses that he saw in the artwork and the writings and all these introductions that he saw as a resurgence of idolatry. He denounced it powerfully. It appealed to people. He sort of built up this brand of rejecting that which was new or being this resurgence of what was old. And people followed him. Thousands would come to his sermons. Many believed him. They looked at his writings. They said, this guy knows what's going on. He provided a voice of clarity in a time of a lot of moral confusion. Savonarola was an eloquent speaker and was able to command the pulpit and the imaginations of many. He spoke very fiery terms. He has this great remark. In the olden days, the chalices were made of wood, but the hearts were golden. Now the chalices are gold and the hearts are made of wood. Like these indictments against those in the political authority, against those in the curia, and against the Pope himself. And he got himself in trouble out of his own kind of pride. He kind of soaked this up. And I visited St. Mark's, and they still have his rooms there, Savonarola's rooms, and rooms plural. Everyone else seemed to have one little room with a nice little painting from Fra Angelico, because Fra Angelico must have just got really excited that everyone wanted to do paintings in his rooms, and that's how we end up with these beautiful Fra Angelico paintings of the Annunciation or of the Crucifixion. But Girolamo Savonarola's rooms were larger, and there were more of them. And he started giving into these excesses, and his moral character became compromised. And his speaking out against the corruption of the political authorities, he eventually was himself killed. Ironically, he had this thing that was called the bonfire of the vanities. He got everyone to get all the artwork that was terrible, to steal it if you had to, throw it in the center of the town, and burn it. And it was this massive fire. And they did this multiple times. One time, someone said, I'll pay you a huge sum, 20,000 crowns, which I imagine is a lot of money, to just rescue some of the artwork because it was priceless. And some of it probably was very good. Not all of it was morally problematic. And they wouldn't let that happen. So several times they did the bonfire of the vanities. And it seemed like Florence was converted for a time. Savonarola was killed. He was hung. And he was burned in the very same spot where he had the bonfire of the vanities. And only like 14, 15 years later, they go right back to all the immorality they experienced before. No lasting effect. 1515, St. Philip Neri is born. His father followed Savonarola. He believed him. He thought Savonarola was a saint, and he was martyred. St. Philip Neri grew up with that same kind of notion of this guy being holy, but his approach was much different. He wasn't speaking from pulpits, but when he went to Rome, he ended up countering people one by one. He was sort of a Roman Socrates, talking to individuals on the street, even before his his ordination to the priesthood. And then when he became a priest, his primary influence was not the pulpit, but the confessional. In the confessional, he would speak to people heart to heart. He would sympathize with their failings. He'd accuse himself even of the same problems. He entered into their struggles. He exercised what Newman calls this gift of sympathy. Newman has a sermon about St. Paul and his gift of sympathy, but all of that is applicable to St. Philip Neri. It's applicable to St. John Henry Newman. They entered so fully into everyone else's own woundedness. So much so that as the one who heard him preach as an Anglican said that he knew our hearts. He spoke to us kind of the level of our being. It was a personal interaction. St. Philip did this one-on-one. And from this came a group that became known as the Oratory. It was said of St. Philip Neri that he drew souls as a magnet draws iron. And that Newman writes of him, it is not surprising that with his tenderness, with his prudence, and with the zeal and charity to which both were subordinate, his influence increased year by year, till he gained a place in the heart of the Roman population which he has never lost. It was a very gradual process. One by one, souls were caught. They were not inflamed to die out, but they were brought into a stable relationship, heart to heart, so much so that the Rome that what Philip came to as a young man, which was morally corrupt and had a lot of problems, it was sacked in 1527, and there was a lot of problems there. And the Curia, the papacy, there's some serious problems back then. There was a great transformation, even up to the Pope himself. The Curia had reformed from the inside out through the influence of one person that was radically configured to Christ and so responsive to the movements of the Holy Spirit. One of the writers about Newman said that, like his spiritual father, John Henry Newman caught souls on the fishing rod of personal influence, that is the charism of the Oratory. One of the works that we read as Oratorians that was written by one of these earlier Italians after the model of St. Philip Neri writes this about the how the Oratory works. The subjects of the congregation of the Oratory are fishers and not hunters of souls. Therefore, they must seek to gain them quietly and gently. A fisherman throws his net or hook in silence, and the fish knows not that it is sought until it is taken. The huntsman scours the country with loud cries and firearms, and his prey takes fright, flies, and if possible, escapes and hides. Now, the Oratory lives out this kind of personal influence sort of from the inside out. The members are supposed to know each other as a family, as I mentioned. They're meant to be comfortable around each other. That the Oratory is not meant to be devoid of something that is proper to a home. Comfort, familiar faces, knowing that you are loved. And Newman contrasts the individual Oratorian to sort of the Athenian versus the Spartan when it comes to how they lived out. The Spartans were kind of following a set of roles. They had to be inflicted upon them, and they just had to conform to that to kind of like just be this consistent version. But the Athenian warrior, he was exercised in the way that he saw fit. He had scope about him to do what he needed to do. And so the Athenian would be more like the Oratorian, where individually we have our own autonomy. Each Oratory is autonomous. Each Oratorian is autonomous, but bound in charity to those that are around us. Whereas the Spartan would be more like a Jesuit, and he's a little bit harsh on Jesuits, but like rule following, just kind of fitting into a mold in order to bring about a great conversion. He also uses the example of the Greek phalanx and the Roman legion. The phalanx would be 16 soldiers bound together and having each particular rule that follow. And the Roman legion, every man was able to fight on his own. But those analogies of, I don't know, Newman is kind of drawn to those kind of warlike analogies, probably because they showed up in the Greek orators that he listened. Oratorian and orator are not the same words, just so you know. One is a rhetorician, and one other one is someone who is belongs to an oratory, which is a house of prayer. So an oratorian is one who is part of this house of prayer under the patronage of St. Philip Neri. So, fun fact. So internally, there's this personal influence. There's a vulnerability among those that see each other as family. There's a stability knowing that if you get in a conflict with your brother Oratorian, you won't be kicked out and moved to another Oratory because you're family. Likewise, this is lived out externally. Newman says that the external life of the Oratory in its various ministries reflects the internal life. The Oratory does its work not by the working out of an abstract form or dialectics, but by constant, concrete contact with the soul. How we live internally becomes how we live externally. How we evangelize those around us, how we carry out our pseudo-charisms of the universal call to holiness and the evangelization of young people is hard. It's hard. And Newman lived this out abundantly as a priest of the oratory. His letters are scoured with examples and of him investing in each individual soul that wrote to him. He did so much spiritual direction through a pen. When you compare the letters, you would think that he would just kind of copy the same thing. You get the pray, hope, and don't worry. Not to brag on St. Padre Pio. St. Padre Pio is awesome, by the way. But oftentimes, pray, hope, and don't worry, which is a beautiful thing to say. But Newman would answer each individual with his own words that are tailored for that person, because he wanted it to be a personal contact. And this is also lived out in a way in the idea of the university. What he saw in the life of the oratory was also in his life in Oxford as a tutor and how he exercised influence there. He saw as a very meaningful part of how the university is to function. I'm actually running out of time, but to give you an idea of the quote thread there, if I had to choose between a so-called university, this is the synopsis of that. This is a little bit unfair, but if you could think of a university without professors, a university without students, Newman would prefer a university without professors, essentially, because students, the personal contact between them, matters so much more. Interesting reflection for especially in my campus, the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, how last year it was pretty much no personal contact between students. The university experience was ruined, and in good ways, all the good things about personal contact was ruined, and the bad things too, less parties. But it was destructive to the life of the university as a whole. But the way the university is always going to work is through that what he calls a living voice, that of the breathing form, the expressive countenance, which preaches, which catechizes. Truth, the subtle, invisible, manifold spirit, is poured into the mind of the scholar by his eyes and ears, through his affections, imagination, and reason. When Newman was challenged by an Anglican author in 1864, this author, Charles Kingsley, said that truth never has a home in the Catholic Church. Just look at Dr. Newman. Of course, with him, there's no respect for truth. Newman wrote back, it's like, what the heck are you talking about? This is very much a synopsis of this. And he's like, okay, let's look at this. You became Catholic. You were Catholic the whole time. You lied to us. You said this point. That doesn't make sense. Catholics believe in miracles. That doesn't make sense. Don't even get me started on the Eucharist. The whole Pope thing. This is all. And he just threw this whole invective against all of Catholicism and said, Newman, you're untruthful. And then he has this question at the end, Charles Kingsley. What does Dr. Newman mean? He stresses, what does Dr. Newman mean? And Newman's like, how can I talk? How can I address this? This is all the problems of error coming at me now. 32 years later, from when he did the personal influence, the means of propagating the truth, all this error is thrown at him. How is he going to answer this? How can he resort to the tool of personal influence, which has always been his go-to means? And he found in that question, what does Dr. Newman mean? He said, well, it's not what are my thoughts, what are my writings, what are my ideas, what are the things that I've said. He says, what do I mean? So, okay, I'll tell you what I mean. And he writes the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, a defense of one's life, that shows the history of his religious opinions and gives a full picture. And this, actually, Newman was not popular among Anglicans because he converted to Catholicism. But then they read this Apologia Pro Vita Sua, public opinion changed. Newman's influence then in the Anglican Church continued actually after that. It was in the whole English-speaking world, among Catholics and Protestants. It had an amazing effect of rehabilitating his image. Didn't work so well in non-English speaking places like the Vatican, but that took care of itself when a new pope got elected and Newman was made a cardinal. But even the whole work of Apologia Pro Vita Sua is sort of a tracing out of the personal influences upon Newman. When one person spoke to him about the sort of the evangelical, the Calvinistic notions of predestination, how he ate that up, how someone else opened him up to other things like the evidences for God, or how someone else opened him up towards the church fathers, towards having a higher kind of liturgy. This is all traced out through his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and is itself a testament to how personal influence affected him and allowed him to have that same personal influence for others who read that work. Now, the last thing that I mentioned, I know I'm over time, is the Newman's great sort of philosophical work called The Grammar of Assent, an essay in aid of a grammar of assent. Most of Newman's works were in response to controversies, things he was asked to write, or collections of lectures. Like the Apologia Pro Vita Sua was in response to that controversy. The Idea of the University is a collection of lectures. Other things he wrote were like for a purpose. He wanted to set down in a treatise what his thought were. What are the anthropological principles of how our mind works? Not just through deductions and logic, but with the real, with the concrete, with things that inflame us in our minds and our imaginations, things that we adhere to with an assent that is unconditional. He did this in the Grammar of Assent. He gives us a lot of terminology and things that are really helpful to understand. But and there's of course the phrase the illative sense, which is something he made up, but explains how we're able to have certainty even when there's not logical certainty. But anyway, Newman's big thrust there is the importance of what we call the real. And he says, the heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion. Logic and being abstract and being notional does not grip us on the level of our being. It does not reach the realm of the heart. What he calls real assent, the assent of the imagination, we might even call a heart knowledge, a heart assent. This is what grips us. This is what inflames martyrs, allows people to adhere with a steadfastness in the face of death. That is how truth spreads. It's through the heart. It involves, of course, the reason. It always involves the mind. Our minds are made for truth, but it comes to us in a uniquely personal way. Louis Boyer, the biographer of Newman, one of the biographers of Newman, his book, Newman, His Life and Spirituality, is one of the best biographies of Newman that I've read, and I highly recommend it. It's very, very readable. He writes, "For it is as person to person that God reveals himself. God becomes someone for us, someone to whom we belong, someone who has given all, even his son, to save us from our own disobedience." He writes further, "For Newman, God is never seen as an idea, a notion, but as a concrete reality, confronting man in the consciousness of his own human situation and being. The supreme reality who, as such, commands of man not only an attitude of absolute respect, but the total commitment and surrender of his existence." Heart speaks to heart. In 1879, when Newman was made a cardinal, an honorary thing given to him because he was only a priest and did not become a bishop, he remained a priest. But Pope Leo XIII said, "I'm making him a cardinal because I want to say something." His image among all Catholics was rehabilitated. He said, "A shroud has been lifted." And he had an opportunity to have a crest and to have a quote. What was he going to have on there? It was a line from St. Francis de Sales, one of his own letters, I believe, or part of his sermons. A short phrase, cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. What Newman had as his motto, as a cardinal, defined him for his entire life. It influenced how he lived out his priesthood as a Catholic, and even before that as an Anglican. And I think that personal influence is going to be the main way if we're going to confront a society that's already rejected truth and has substituted many errors. It's going to be through influence, the slow but sure way in which we're going to gain more and more souls for Christ. Let's conclude there. If you have any questions. Maybe so back a few minutes over, which I expected. Yeah. But any questions? Yeah, cool.
Okay, so I had a friend recently tell me some quote, I'm going to butcher it a bit, where Newman says something along the lines of like, as long as I was an Aristotelian, I remained an Anglican, but I had to become a Platonist to become Catholic, something along those lines. Have you heard of that quote before? And like, what exactly is meant by that?
Okay, I don't know, because
Okay.
in Grammar of Assent, you can see the sort of rehabilitated Aristotelianism, the emphasis on the real, on the concrete, of the knowledge that comes to us through the senses, but also through the imagination, which is a much bigger thing than just like, oh, I just imagine this. Like, it actually means like the impress of the real upon us. This is a very Aristotelian concept. So the Grammar of Assent stresses the real, and there might be a sense in which you had to become a Platonist to do it. I don't know. It doesn't exactly gel. Depends on what you mean, because I don't think he would, probably in fairness, he would not associate Platonism with merely notional. I don't know how to make sense of that. Because one of my initial projects with Newman was to try to see how Aristotle was informing him, and I gave up because it just was hard to do that. I'm not an Aristotle scholar at all, so I don't know how that would work. But it is true that Newman had a huge respect for Aristotle, and he said to think rightly is to think like Aristotle. I don't know when he said that though. Maybe it was as an Anglican.
So very generally speaking, could you talk more about the influence of Francis de Sales on Newman?
Yeah. So fun fact, Francis de Sales was an Oratorian. He was also Bishop of Geneva and was a major figure in the Catholic response to Protestantism. But he started an oratory, not in Geneva, but another city. He was the provost, the head of that oratory, as bishop, I think, even before he got moved to Geneva. And he was friends with the early Oratorians. I speculate, but it's merely speculation, that he met St. Philip Neri because he was in Rome when St. Philip Neri was alive. And of course, he would have met St. Philip Neri. Come on, who wouldn't? All the English martyrs would go get a blessing from St. Philip Neri before they went back to England to get martyred. Of course, St. Francis de Sales would have at least stopped by to say hi. So whatever. But he definitely knew St. Philip Neri's disciples like Baronius or Baronius did church history. That's Baronius Press. That's why they have Baronius. Okay, fine. But he knew some of the early Oratorians and adopted a lot of spirituality for himself. And his emphasis is what we can now call, since the Second Vatican Council, the universal call to holiness. The ability for any of us to strive for holiness in our lives as members of the laity, without even being clergy or religious. And so that was a huge thrust of St. Francis de Sales, especially his introduction to the devout life. Newman, as a Catholic, seemed to really imbibe that aspect of St. Francis de Sales, and found in him some kind of a kindred soul that didn't have sort of the excesses of Italian spirituality, but I think just resonated much with him. So when Newman had a private chapel in his bedroom when he was much older, because he was a frail priest and still needed to offer mass, he had a painting of St. Francis de Sales over his private altar. So I don't know exactly how much you read of him, but it seems like you could say that there's a lot of things in Francis de Sales that come up in Newman, and Newman kind of expands on some of the same ideas, using these ideas of personal influence and the speaking of the heart.
I just wonder where your oratory is.
Pittsburgh,
Pittsburgh? Okay.
great place.
Would you recommend visiting?
Yeah, you can come show up. It's nice.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a small chapel. It's a nice advantage of it actually that we can only fit 96 in the pews.
Okay. So they're very personal, like you
A
said.
little bit more. And I was actually struck by that as a student. I go to the oratory, I'm like, the homilies, first off, are better. And so, I mean, compared to my experience growing up as a Catholic, the homilies were really good, but I actually wanted to pay attention to them because I could just hear the person's voice instead of hearing through a speaker system and have them stand far away. So that helped a lot. So even the smallness of it, I really appreciate how it's conducive towards that. And then how we carry out ministry, particularly in campus ministry, because we have a Newman Center, is a lot of it's just personal influence. Meeting up with students one-on-one. Most of my time is spent meeting one-on-one with students. It's an amazing blessing. A lot of our efforts are confessions. We have a good amount of confessions scheduled every day, and a lot of people come, students and non-students. And it's a lot of that personal influence is lived out through the confessional. So it kind of lives on in that way. And I think the Catholic Church, generally speaking, it works through that. And actually, we're also blessed to have focus missionaries, which, with a little bit of tweaking of terminology, it's the same approach. One-on-one investing, pouring out in small groups, imitation of Christ in the early church, but definitely fits right within the oratory model of personal influence, heart speaking to heart.
Maybe I missed it, but when Newman studied the different types of orders that he wanted to enter, why specifically did he end up choosing the oratory?
He looked at Dominicans very closely because he figured they have a great respect for the intellectual life and for the life of study. He needed whatever he went to, and had to have respect for study. And so, like Franciscans, and the examples he had in Rome to work with were just not there. The Jesuits, great respect for study, but the approach wasn't just, I don't know. And one of the, I think it was Cardinal Manning, he said to Newman, he said, hey, you should check out St. Philip's Oratory. And so Manning, I think it was, takes credit for Newman looking at the oratory and bringing the oratory in England. And he found like, oh, this actually works. St. Philip Neri, this can work. The other ones just in like Dominicans, he wrote about them. They have a wine cellar, and they spend a lot of their time trying to disprove the Immaculate Conception, which was 1840s, was a hot debate right then because it was 1854 when it was actually defined. So he's like, I don't want to deal with that. And he loved St. Thomas, but he didn't think like St. Thomas in the same kind of way. So the oratory ended up working well because it had a room for scholarship. And a lot of the things that he liked about the way he lived as an Anglican, he had a community where he lived with others. It was called like a monastery, but it was like, it made sense. Like everything kind of fit with the oratory. And it was, getting the oratory started in England was hugely stressful. Like you read, oh man, it's just personal conflicts and, like the people at each other's throats. And he didn't get along with Frederick Faber, who was another prominent oratorian. Faber is his own kind of, they're just so different. It was a mess, but it worked. He had, I think he had more trials. He had different trials as a Catholic than as an Anglican, but they were pretty intense. The hierarchy kind of like, they reestablished English hierarchy, and the bishops there kind of abandoned him and almost got him in prison. It was bad. Whole nother story. But now Newman's a saint, so that's cool. He wins.
Do you know how many people are a part of your oratory?
What was that?
How many people are a
Oh,
part?
so oratories typically are smaller. So you end up like in 3 to 10 would be kind of normal.
Okay.
3 small, really small. 10 is like, oh, that's a really healthy size. We have 8 right now. 8 full members, 6 of which are priests, and 2 are on the way to being priests. One will be ordained a priest in May, and then 2 years later, the other one will be ordained a priest too. So we'll eventually have 8 priests. So we're at a good, healthy number.
Yeah. Like in age too, are they like older and
I'm close to the median age.
medium?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a few years older is the median age because some are older and some are younger.
Cool.
It is what it is. Yeah, great place. Big fan.
All right. Thank you very much.